Welcome to Fitch Painting and Repairs Garage. Today's project, Eleanor has returned to us. We have some more issues with the carburetor. Customers complaining of fuel leaking from the carburetor, and still with the mid-range performance issues. And left rear turn signal was in op. And so we've already started on her. What we've done is we've checked the charging system on this bike, and we we give a little test ride, and then we also put it on the bench and ran it and test the charging system, check the turn signal system, and we're waiting to see if she leaks fuel. And she hasn't been leaking any fuel yet. The petcock has been left on. She hasn't leaked any fuel. So we're not quite certain what's going on there. Just a little backstory on this. I had it once already, went through it and cleaned the carburetor. And when I picked the bike up, I prior to picking the bike up, I stopped by and test rode the motorcycle and took a look at it. And yes, it was coughing and mid-range performance issues. And later I returned and I picked up the motorcycle and loaded the bike, and then and test riding it. Then I had or when I came home and unloaded it from the trailer, I adjusted the idle. It was idling really super low, so I bumped the idle up. And then I never had any issues with it. I gave a minor cleaning to the carburetor, cleaned the air filter, and put it all back together. And never once did it ever cough, spit, sputter, leak any fuel. I tested all the air intake, tightened down the exhaust at the heads, and checked everything for any leaks or anything. The bike ran great. Now, little backstory is the customer had a previous friend work on it, or another shop or something. I'm not quite certain which it is. If the guy has a shop or if he's just a friend, But anyways, the customer that owns this bike had originally purchased the bike, he said, about 9 years ago or so, and it had a Mikuni flat side carburetor on it. And he was having some runnability issues or something like that. He took it to the guy. The guy said he fixed it. It didn't do any good. He'd done some other work to the bike or something. Long story short, eventually the guy went to buy and decided to buy another carburetor to fix his problem. Well, they bought some kind of cheap knockoff Mikuni style carburetor and mounted it to it. Now, I have since found out, and the owner has told me that it is mismatched size. Like the carburetor is supposed to be like a 44 millimeter and the intake's a 42, or possibly the intake's a 42. The intake might be a 40, the carburetor might be a 42. But anyways, he told me it's mismatched somehow, and they just heated up the gasket and shoved it on. So I don't know what they've done there, if they've done the donut. I don't know what they've done. So I have to pull it all apart completely. The cleaning and everything was done with the carburetor on the bike. So the carburetor was never removed. I had tested it for intake leaks prior to cleaning it and opening the carburetor to do the cleaning. There was no intake leaks or anything like that. And like I said, after adjusting the idle, it was idled really low. And if you idle these bikes too low, your charging system's not putting out, and so therefore it's running solely off the battery. And if your battery's slightly weak, you're gonna have ignition misfire problems. So bump the idle up, and man, she ran great. So in this time, what we're gonna do, customer asked, remove the carburetor and replace it with a new one, or possibly find a used CV carb, Kean stock carb, and go back with a stock carb setup on this. Well, I got to pull it all apart and see if the parts are matching and see what's going on with this. And the plan is just go ahead and remove this carburetor. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And we also did turn signal. We figured out the turn signal. And what it ended up being was he had this little control module installed in there. And you see here where it's melted. And what it does is turn on, it makes it so your turn signals operate as running lights and turn signals. And we were having an intermittent issue when we worked on it before. And it was working when we took it back, and then all of a sudden it wasn't working. And testing it, what I found out was, yeah, that's melted, but that probably melted because, I don't know if you can see up in there. I'm not seeing it. Right there. Right there. That wire is the hot wire for the turn signal, and it's rubbed bare. So it was rubbing on the inside where it runs through here. See how it comes through, and it's all clipped. So somebody had rewired this whole entire turn signal issue. Left-hand turn signals seem to be an issue on this. Mine's not working properly. I've rebuilt the harness once already. It doesn't automatically flash. It comes on, stays on, so you can manually flash it with the button. Just got to remember on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, so you don't run down the road with it on all the time. But anyway, so I removed that, and I pulled that wire loose so it wasn't touching, and all of a sudden the turn signals are working just fine. So that seems to solve that problem. So we are going to go through, remove the entire carburetor. We got to remove breather, carburetor, and the intake. We'll also take off the fuel tank, but before we do all that, we're going to pull a fuel sample out of the tank, because we got to drain the tank, and we're going to take it off. It's got a petcock on it, but these style tanks, I got that crossover on front. So if you don't drain the tank to take the tank off, you got to pull this tube. Yeah, it makes a mess everywhere. So I have a tendency to drain the tank. The newer ones have the fuel injection systems has a quick release setup on it, and you pop that loose. And other bikes, they don't have that crossover on it and stuff. So pain in the ass to deal with, but we'll do it. We'll do it right. We're gonna pull. We gotta pull the ignition. We gotta pull this dashboard off. Unhook the vent, unhook the wires for the speedo and all that. This has got an electronic speedo on it. It's not a cable driven one. Pull that, drain the tank, disconnect the fuel lines, pull the bolt here, bolt the bolt here, and then you got to pull this line. Usually you just take off one side, plug it, and then you lift it up and off. And then once you got it off, but to work on it, you don't have to pull the tank completely off. What I like to do is I take the rear bolt, and then I lift up the back of the tank. It lifts up about that far, and you get a block of wood, and you put up under it. Just take a little block of wood or something, and you put up under it, and holds the tank up. Gives you enough clearance to get in under there to pull your carburetor out. So you can service your carburetor without having to take that off and not have to deal with that. So there is enough room that you don't have to even disconnect all this stuff. You just unbolt this, and then you just lift it up. And sometimes, if your fuel line doesn't have any slack in it, you might have to pop the fuel line loose so that you can lift it up far enough. But usually you got plenty of room. So we're going to go ahead and start removing the carburetor, fuel tank, fuel sample, all that stuff, and then I have to rewire this whole assembly. So we got to pull this off. This is an assembly. You take these two back Allen out, and this whole assembly sits on these little pegs I've showed you before in another video, and you just slide it out and set it out of the way. And then I can get to the wire that's up in there and rewire that, get it heat shrink covered and all that stuff so it doesn't rub again. And that'll fix that. And then We're going to pull this carburetor apart because of the fuel leaking issue that he thought he had. I don't know if he laid it over or dumped it at the... He said something. I was talking to another guy, so I was a little distracted. But it's possible he dumped it, and that's what caused the fuel to leak. So that's possible. But I think the fuel leaking is common on these older bikes, these carbureted bikes, because this is a 96. There is an active recall on this bike in regards to the petcock failing. And this one's got a replacement aftermarket. And this one here is not a vacuum operated petcock, which is standard on this bike. And the reason being is inside the carburetor, this big fuel line coming off, right? That's a lot of fuel flow comes through there. You got 5 gallons of gas on a full tank of gas, right? And what happens when you got 5 gallons of gas pushing gravity fed through that petcock onto that tiny little float valve? And what I will show you real quick is I have another carburetor just like this one. This is the float valve. And the guy who owns this bike had this other carburetor. And this one here is a 42, so I don't know if that one's a 44 or what it is. We'll pull it apart and measure it and everything. But this is the float valve that I'm talking about. This is the assembly. This is the seat, and that's the little valve inside there. And it's got a little tiny rubber tip that goes down. And so that little rubber tip is all that stops the fuel. And then when your float, your fuel level gets low in the carburetor, the float, dips down, which raises this little valve up and allows the fuel to flow into the carburetor to maintain proper fuel amount in the carburetor. Well, when you have a motorcycle that's supposed to run and it's mounted right down in there, see? And so the float lifts it. When it gets too low, it lifts up and the fuel goes in and fills up the bowl. Carburetor normally sits in there up the other way. Sits in there like that. And the float bowl is on the bottom. So this is the same style carburetor that is. This is a cheap Mikuni flat slide carburetor. So we don't know what's wrong with that. With that one, the customer had given me that. Said it was no good. So this one here makes a ton of noise. So we're going to pull it apart, and we're going to look for an actual Mikuni to match what's on here and put it back together properly. If not, we'll go back with a Kian CV carburetor and just go back to a 40mm setup, stock setup on it with an aftermarket breather. That's what I'm running. And it's all about putting the jetting in it, getting a performance needle, set up, like a Dynajet kit, and put that in there, So, and that makes these bikes really come alive. They dyno out, with significant horsepower gains and all that. So, yeah, everybody thinks, oh, I gotta go S&S, I gotta go Mikuni, for performance. Well, you're inherently adding troubles into your problems and reliability issues, and the reason being is, on a race bike, you constantly have to tinker with them to maximize performance, or else they don't run right. Well, that's what you're doing by putting all those performance parts on your bike. So if you want reliability, you want to be able to start it the same and it runs the same every single time, you need to have the stock carburetor on it, and then just put like a 150 main jet in it or something like that, a Dynajet kit. You might have to adjust the clip height on the needle setting until you get your performance right, depending on where you're located and environmental issues. We're here in Florida and we're at sea level, and it's very humid most of the year, but during the winter time we have long periods of very dry, cool weather. And so the bikes run awesome during that time. But during the summertime, when it's hot and muggy and They don't want to run with the crap, so you got to monkey with them and adjust them. So, all right, well, stay tuned, and I'll let you know what's going on with this.